All right, students, in this latest section of Chapter 17, we're going to talk about the events that lead right up to the Civil War. The 1860 election was quite unusual, and my pictures are all cut off here, but I go over this in class. The Democrats continue to be split on sectional lines, philosophical lines, I like to think of it actually, but it ends up being sectional lines with Northern Democrats wanting to be able to vote on slavery with Douglas's idea of popular sovereignty. But the Southern Democrats felt like they had just won a huge court case with the Dred Scott case, and they had, saying that they could take slavery anywhere they wanted to. And they're like, no, we don't care about your popular sovereignty, Douglas. And so they decided they were going to nominate their own person, and that was going to be John C. Breckinridge. So the Northern Democrats nominated Stephen Douglas, who had been already looked at as a presidential candidate. Remember, we talked about that earlier when he was running for the Senate. And then this John C. Breckinridge was nominated by the Southern Democrats because they didn't care about voting on slavery. They just thought it should go everywhere. Then there were some moderates from the North and the South who didn't want really to confront slavery. They just kind of wanted to ignore it as if you could. And they formed something new called the Constitutional Union Party. And they chose this man, John Bell, as their candidate. And I just put a little bit about John Bell on here. He was from Tennessee, which was sort of a border state, slave-owning state, but still an upper South state. And there's not too many giant, huge, sprawling plantations in Tennessee. There are maybe a few, but not a lot of them. And Bell was really sort of a moderate, flip-flopping type of person. He was for Jackson, but then didn't really believe in the spoils system, but was sided with Jackson against the banks. And so he was really sort of all over the place. He is a moderate, usually is. And so now counting Lincoln running with the Republicans, there were 4 people running for president. And there's this interesting political cartoon. And we did this in class, this overview parts topic in relationship to conclusion. And Lincoln is drawn here larger than the other 3 for a couple reasons. First, his party was not divided. The Republicans all supported Lincoln. Republicans were concentrated mostly in the North, and his vote was not divided. And while the Democrats were divided. And also Lincoln was actually physically taller than all the rest of them. That was a thing. He was probably 6'4", and really literally was taller than all the rest of the candidates. All right. So with the Democrats divided and the Constitutional Union Party siphoning off a couple votes, Lincoln won a clear majority of the electoral votes. You can see the map here below. But his name was not even on the ballot in some of the southern states. And so he won the election without a single southern vote. And the map, I think, is interesting because look here, Stephen Douglas, the one that the Northern Democrats nominated, he only got Missouri and part of New Jersey here. Didn't take hardly any Northern votes at all. Lincoln got all the rest, plus Oregon and California. While Breckinridge took all the Southern votes, and Bell did siphon off some of these right here, these middle states. His home state of Tennessee, obviously, Kentucky right the next door neighbor, and then Virginia as well. So it did cause a problem. All right. So during the campaign repeatedly, Lincoln always said that he was not trying to eliminate slavery, but just keep it where it was already and keep it from spreading. But the Southerners don't trust that, and I don't blame them for not trusting it because they didn't trust him, and they don't trust Republicans, and they don't trust the government, and I can completely understand that. So not even before Christmas. So Lincoln is elected in November, and in December, 6 weeks later maybe, South Carolina secedes. And remember, they were this threatening since the nullification crisis, and they become the very first state to secede. All right. You need to know this guy, John Crittenden. His picture is cut off up there in the corner, but he's, I put on there he's from Kentucky because, like I said, if there's a reference to Kentucky, I'm going to make it. You don't need to know that he's from Kentucky, but you do need to know about the Crittenden Plan. It was the very last-ditch effort at a compromise that he made, and it was basically going back to the Missouri Compromise, the Compromise of 1820, and it went nowhere. Because the Republicans refused to have anything to do with it because they were like, no, are you kidding? We just won the presidency. We control the House of Representatives. We're not going back to that plan. We don't need to. And even the Democrats want nothing to do with it because they felt like, well, I don't think so. We have the court on our side. We just have the Dred Scott case handed down to us a couple years ago that says any limits you put on slavery are unconstitutional, and we're not going to go back on that. So he got nowhere with his plan, but he was the last person to propose some sort of compromise trying to hold the country together. All right, so after this, it wasn't very long before other states joined South Carolina, and I want you to look at this because there might be some test questions. It was the states of the Deep South that joined South Carolina. It was South Carolina and Georgia, Florida, Mississippi, Alabama, Louisiana, Texas that came next, okay? And those states met up in Alabama, in Mobile, and they decided Mobile was going to be their capital. They elected Jefferson Davis as their president, and they said that it's because of states' rights that we're allowed to secede. They cited the fact that the federal government would not enforce the Fugitive Slave Act, which I think is partially true. But I also think it's true that the states felt like they had joined the United States as a group. They voluntarily joined the United States, and so they could choose to leave if they wanted to. And it wasn't just the Fugitive Slave Act, but they felt like there were tariffs over many, many years, and they had been abused over many years. And their pleas and their needs had been ignored. And so now that was the last straw. Lincoln's election was the last straw. All right, so Lincoln's election happens, and this is his inauguration in March. And Buchanan does, this is what Buchanan does. He sends a letter to Congress saying that South Carolina and those states have no right to secede, but he doesn't have any power to stop them. I'm not sure he even tried to stop them. If you can imagine what would have happened if Andrew Jackson had been president, or George Washington, or even John Adams had been president, I think the states would have been stopped. But still, some states had not seceded, and so Lincoln is hoping they're going to stay. It doesn't work out so well for him, but some of them do stay. All right. So as these states secede, though, any federal arsenal or fort within them is going to be part of that now. So if and many of these places had been built during the War of 1812. So if there's a fort or an arsenal inside of, say, the state of Louisiana that's built, or like I'm familiar with Alabama. So in Mobile Bay, there are several forts. And those forts then become part of the Confederacy. The soldiers that are there in those forts have a choice to make. They can leave or they can stay and fight with the Confederacy. Now, this is what happens here at Fort Sumter in South Carolina. Fort Sumter's out on an island, and those soldiers were stuck on an island because it's kind of hard to leave from an island. And they sent a message to Lincoln saying, hey, we're out of supplies here. We're stuck on an island and we have no more supplies. We're going to have fresh water. And so Lincoln gets this message shortly after he becomes president and sends a message to the governor of South Carolina, not to the president of the Confederacy, but to the governor of South Carolina, saying, I'm going to send a ship with supplies to this fort. I'm not sending any guns or ammo. I'm not sending any soldiers on the ship. I'm just sending a ship with supplies to Fort Sumter. But when news of this gets to Jefferson Davis, he doesn't hesitate a second, but he orders that cannons be set up on land, and they start shelling Fort Sumter pretty quickly. So you need to know that the attack on Fort Sumter on April 12th, you see it's in red, that is the beginning of the Civil War. Just like we have the battles of Lexington and Concord are the beginning of the Revolution. This is important. The attack on Fort Sumter by the Confederacy is the beginning of the Civil War. I think this is a kind of cool picture. It's a kind of photograph. Like I said, the Civil War is the first war with real photography, and this is a photograph of the shelling of Fort Sumter. All right, again, this attack signals the start of the Civil War. I have a neat map down here at the bottom. So the map shows you in red the first states that fell away. And then after that, Lincoln decides when, his fort is being fired upon, and he hears about this, he doesn't have a choice but to declare war. And he calls for volunteers. And, of course, he doesn't have any trouble getting volunteers either. And when the other states hear about that, Virginia, North Carolina, Tennessee, and Arkansas then also decide to join up with the rest of the South. Please look at the last bullet point on this frame. These states are very important to Lincoln: West Virginia, Delaware, Maryland, Kentucky, and Missouri. Those states are called border states. They have slavery in them, but they stay with the Union. They don't leave. So these ones right here, these dark purple ones, please look at this map. These are border states that have slavery, but they stay. In fact, this is how we get West Virginia. There's no West Virginia until the Civil War. That part of Virginia breaks off at this point and says, we're not leaving. Our economy right here, this part of Virginia, does not depend heavily on slavery, and we're not leaving. So please pay attention to that map.